I'm Lisa Sachs, Director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. Welcome to your academic year. We're starting early this year. I hope you've been having a great week. And this is the first of our, I should have checked, I think this is our 14th annual speaker series on national investment law and policy. So we're really delighted to start off with a good friend and partner and colleague. So without further ado, because we have such short time, I'd like to introduce Taylor St. John, who's a lecturer at the University of St. Andrew and has been a research fellow at Pluricourts at the University of Oslo. All right? And has worked at LSE and then for many years at Oxford. And her interests very much align with ours and her research is all on global economic governance and economic diplomacy, and in particular on the politics of foreign investment and on investors in dispute settlement. And so without further ado, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay, so I have a microphone, which is mostly for the recording, but everyone can hear me in the back, right? Okay, let me know if at any point you can't. So first off, thank you to Lisa, to everyone at CCSI. You may not know, but CCSI is a really important hub in investment law and investment policy research. So all over the world, people know CCSI, government officials know CCSI. So you're all really lucky to have this resource here, and it's fantastic for me to be able to be here. So today what I'm going to do is discuss some recent research about why governments consent to investors in arbitration in their domestic law. So how many of you have had a class on investment law? A couple? Okay. So traditionally we think about governments consenting to investor-state arbitration in an investment treaty. And that is where sort of 70–75% of the cases come from. But some governments, and I'll show you which governments in a little while, also consent to investor-state arbitration. So this means that foreign investors don't have to use their local courts or their national courts. They can go right to international arbitration and have their cases heard in Paris or Washington. Some governments consent to that in their national law, right? So they write a national or domestic law that says, instead of going to our courts, you can take us, the government, directly to international arbitration. And so what my colleague Tarald and I wanted to do is we wanted to ask why? Why do governments do that, right? Why is this a good idea? And I should add as a caveat, Tarald now negotiates for the Norwegian government, but at the time that we wrote this paper, he did not. And this paper does not in any way reflect the views of the Norwegian government, right? It reflects my views today as an academic. So what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of the provisions that provide consent in national investment laws. Right? What does this look like? And then I'm going to ask the question, why? And the exploration that we focus on is we focus on technical assistance or technical advisory work, right? We think that this little thing called FIAS, or the Foreign Investment Advisory Service, plays a really important role in explaining why so many governments around the world provide consent to investors in arbitration in their domestic law. And then finally, I'm going to close out with, I've written policy conclusions. They're going to be more policy questions, which I hope will be provocative and spur some debate. But in the Q&A, I also, if you have any questions about what I've talked about, or things you want explained more, feel free to ask. Okay, so as some of you may know, there are three instruments through which governments consent to investor arbitration. They consent through treaties, which are the kind of best known, also through contracts, and also through domestic laws. And so to date, treaties have commanded most of these scholarly and the policy attention, but we're seeing more and more attention on contracts and on domestic laws. So UNCTAD is producing more research on domestic laws, and there's also exciting academic work from Jared Hepburn, if anyone's interested, and forthcoming from Jonathan Benicio. And there's very good reason to care about domestic laws. So there have been 61 known investor-state arbitration cases that come from these domestic laws. So there's, of course, potential for a lot more. So there are over 100 investment laws that are enforced today. But what we focus on, and what's on this map over here, are laws that mention or consent to arbitration. And does anyone notice anything about this map? Does anyone notice anything about the countries that aren't in color?
Most developed countries.
Yes, there are no developed countries, right? So we see all of Western Europe, the US, even Chile and Mexico, right, the newer OECD countries, they have not mentioned or consented to arbitration in their national personal laws. And even, right, the emerging market countries, right, Brazil, South Africa, China, India, they're also not mentioning or consenting to arbitration in their domestic law, right? And if we think about this, can you think about the US government, maybe even not this administration, just any US government, saying, you know what, we're going to write a law, we're going to put it through Congress, and it's going to say that instead of going to US courts, any foreign investor can take us directly to arbitration in Paris. Right? That's like, it's unimaginable. It's almost a laughable idea, but that's what these countries are doing when they do this. Okay, so for our study, what we were interested in is what countries have passed a domestic law that provides consent to arbitration between 1986 and 2015 that either mentions or consents to investors in arbitration. And so we found 74 laws that mention it and 42 laws that provide consent to it. And some of these provisions, some of these laws are remarkably clear, and others are remarkably ambiguous, right? And quite a few of these provisions are actually pretty ambiguous. And when a provision is ambiguous, what's the consequence of that? It gives the tribunal more discretion to say if it has jurisdiction or not. So I put 3 examples on the slide here. You don't have time to read them. You have to trust me that Azerbaijan's law, I think, is pretty clear that it doesn't provide consent to arbitration, it just mentions it. Belarus's law is a little bit more ambiguous. A tribunal may find consent, it may find that it has jurisdiction, it may not. I think that Burundi's law, well, not we, just me today. Charles Milliger has a view here. We think that it probably does provide consent. But given the possibility for subjectiveness here, right? Our goal was to try and say which of these laws provided consent. We recognize this is subjective. And also, since, as those of you who've taken investment law courses may know, tribunals don't necessarily have to follow what previous tribunals have decided. So the interpretation of these clauses has not been particularly consistent by tribunals. So therefore, what we do is, at the end of our paper, we include an annex. And it's quite long. And what it has is it has each clause that we think mentions arbitration, and if we think it provides consent or doesn't provide consent. And so how we've coded this is if a tribunal has interpreted this provision already, then we follow what that tribunal has said, then we follow legal scholarship, and then we follow a consistent set of principles, which we outline in the end. Okay, so why consent in domestic law is puzzling. As I said earlier, 74 of these laws mention arbitration, 42 of them provide consent to arbitration, probably. So the question that we have is why, right? Fundamentally, why does any government mention or consent to investors in arbitration in their domestic legislation? And from where I sit in my very comfortable academic office, this is really puzzling, right? So here's sort of what we know. We know that the costs of arbitration, of including one of these clauses, it's going to be extremely costly, right? Awards are in the hundreds of millions of dollars, sometimes now the billions of dollars. Even if there is no award, legal fees are routinely in the millions of dollars for countries to defend themselves against these claims. The exposure to risk is arguably greater with a domestic law where all foreign investors theoretically could bring a claim, as opposed to a treaty, right, where only investors or firms of one nationality can bring a claim. So they're opening themselves up to a lot of risk here. What are the benefits? Well, the benefits are pretty uncertain. Presumably, government officials are anticipating more inward investment, right? But there's no empirical evidence that consent in domestic law is correlated with, let alone leads to, additional foreign investment. And also, if you think about this from the perspective of a foreign investor, if the investor is sophisticated enough to really care about arbitration and they want access to arbitration, they're probably going to want it in a contract or a treaty, right? Because a domestic law is not very credible. A government or a future government can rewrite that law and remove consent at any point in time. So it's not great in terms of benefits. Also, governments aren't emulating successful examples, right? As I said, no OECD state, no developed state, no BRIC or anything else like that. Those sorts of states don't provide this sort of concept. So this isn't an emulation story. And finally, if we think about it from domestic politics, there aren't going to be any domestic constituents that lobby for this provision in domestic law either, right? It gives foreigners a right that citizens don't have. And unlike if we think about a bilateral treaty, where maybe some domestic citizens get, I don't know, better access to a foreign market or something like that, none of that's going to happen if it's domestic law. So it's really puzzling, right? Why would a government do this? Those of you that are familiar with investment law may be thinking, we'll see, sure, but the real issue here is governments, these government officials, are thinking that foreign investors don't trust their local courts, right? That's kind of the story that we're told. So officials believe that this lack of trust is impeding investment. If they provide access to arbitration, then more investment will come. Okay. If that's correct, we should see a correlation empirically, right? We should see that where local courts or the protection of property rights are perceived to be particularly weak, in those countries, we should see governments providing access to arbitration. But that's not what we see here. So in this figure, you have the quality of property rights is going up on this axis, and the consent to arbitration are these little black crosses. And what do you see, right? It ranges. It's all over. So there's not a strong correlation there between protection of property rights and then providing this access to you. So what is going on, right? Now we have a real puzzle. The answer that we focus on in the presentation I will focus on is technical assistance, right? So if you download the paper, you'll see that we go through several previous explanations from scholarly work about why countries provide consent to arbitration. Many of those are from treaties. But the one that we find the most support for is technical assistance. And again, we focus specifically on FIAS, the Foreign Investment Advisory Service within the World Bank. Now, has anyone ever heard of FIAS here? No. Sorry, it's pretty small, but everyone's heard of the World Bank, right? It's a part of the World Bank. And as far as we know, the World Bank is the only international organization that has ever recommended that governments provide access to arbitration in their domestic laws. So the OECD or UNCTAD, other international organizations that work in investment law, they don't suggest to governments to provide consent in their domestic laws. But different arms of the World Bank have written about consent for domestic law. They've suggested it as an idea for about 50 years. So how many of you have heard of the ICSID Convention? Yeah? Good. So the report of the executive directors, which was released with the ICSID Convention in 1965, so not recently, that report mentions that governments can provide consent in their domestic law. And then in the 1960s and 1970s, the ICSID Secretariat started collecting national investment laws. They collected them from all developing states. And they would always, at their annual meetings, say, we stand ready to advise you on your national investment laws whenever you would like. And then in the 1980s, World Bank officials started to define best practices for national investment laws. And that eventually became a template for national investment laws, and it's called Guidelines on the Treatment of Foreign Direct Investment. And at the same time, in the 1980s, FIAS was created. And it was created with a very specific purpose. And that purpose was to, let me see, I have it here, to, quote, provide advice on host country policies that affect the flow of productive foreign investment. And so FIAS does several types of advisory work. They help with reform licensing processes. They help with other types of reform that foreign investors might be interested in. But what we look at is one quite specific part of their work, which is called the investment law reform work. And its aim is to, quote, help countries attract and retain foreign investment by recommending legislative reforms, right? So this is what they're doing. And according to their annual reports, FIAS offers concrete recommendations that are based on international best practices. And so when we would interview FIAS officials, they would often use this concept of best practice, right, to describe what it is that they do. But our question is, well, whose best practice? Right? Whose best practice? What is best practice? And so for FIAS, there's a handbook that sets out what they see as best practice. And this is the section that's relevant to arbitration in domestic law. And so there's a little bit of constructive ambiguity in this phrasing, but it does urge governments to provide access to arbitration. And the last line is also very interesting for those of you that have investment law in particular. It is not advisable to include in the provision a mandatory period of negotiations before filing for arbitration. Which is pretty interesting, right? Would you advise your clients that? Maybe, maybe not? Okay, seeing some nodding. Seeing some quiet from first week of school nodding. So, to us, this sort of suggests they're urging best practice, or they're defining best practice as providing consent to arbitration. But it's a little bit unclear. So we also then interviewed FIAS officials about the work that they do. And so this is how they describe it. To put things in perspective, I think we advocate for ISDS, which is arbitration, as a good international practice, also to ensure alignments with IIAs, which are investment treaties. And the other quote is, I think the broad idea is to ensure that the law either gives rights that are higher than those already available in treaties, or to match them. This is the core message from our side. We say that it is always better to have your domestic law in alignment with your international laws that you have already accepted like 15 or 20 years ago in the movement. So this leads us to our hypothesis that receiving technical assistance on investment law reform from FIAS increases the probability that a state will consent to arbitration in its domestic investment laws, right? And I want to note that we're not arguing that FIAS instructs national officials to insert access to arbitration, right? There's not coercion involved. What we think is happening is that very well-educated professional World Bank advisors or World Bank staff members come into countries, and the way that they frame this issue changes how national governments might see it, right? So they might see, the benefits of this might be more investment and the cost might be different, right, than they would otherwise see it. So that's how we approach this. So if our hypothesis is supported, we will observe a relationship between governments receiving advice from FIAS on the one hand, and then laws that mention arbitration. So that's what we're looking for here. And we do find a statistically significant relationship. If you're interested in the statistics or any of the kind of underlying models, you can find all of that in the paper. What I've got here is a table that just illustrates the connections. So the presence of a FIAS mission is an exceptionally strong predictor of domestic investment laws with arbitration clauses, even when we control for other influences. And so this table shows some of the countries that, for instance, if we take Afghanistan, they received a FIAS mission in 2004, and then in 2005 they passed a law that both mentions and consents to arbitration. Or in Kyrgyzstan, they had 3 FIAS missions in 1998, 99, and 2001. And then in 2003, they passed a law that provides access to arbitration in that law. And the key takeaway is about 50% of the countries that receive advice on reforming their investment law from FIAS end up including arbitration in the next investment law that they pass. So it's not all countries, but that is a very significant result for us, right? And if we think about all the hurdles that exist to passing domestic legislation, right? All the opposition parties, the things that have to go right, that's a remarkably high figure. So this is really having an impact. But of course, there are many governments who receive advice from FIAS and then don't mention arbitration. So it doesn't explain everything, but it explains quite a bit of what's going on. So, as you all know, right, domestic politics, internal ministry politics are different in all countries. So I don't really want to discuss why individual countries made the decisions to include or not include arbitration. We can in the Q&A if you're interested. What I want to do is I want to emphasize what I think is a more general point about the stages at which external advisors, like FIAS, but others as well, can have influence in the drafting of domestic investment laws. So, FIAS projects on domestic law tend to begin with the project being funded and an external consultant and a local lawyer who's not in government being hired, right? So that's the first step, is donor funding and project design. Then there are usually in-country interviews. There's also a sort of mapping exercise. This is appropriate music for what's happening. It's a very grand procedure. So there are diagnostic and scoping exercises, which are usually they're done with the external consultant and the local lawyer. And then what happens is the local lawyer uses the FIAS handbook as well as example clauses that are often handed to them by the external advisors to draft the first law. What's interesting is this person isn't in government, right? So the first draft of this law is being done by someone who's just a private individual with help from outside sources. So those are some places where external advice comes in. Then what happens when FIAS is involved is the law is sent to Washington for review, right? So this could be a domestic, a Kyrgyz law, but it's being sent to the World Bank for review, for comments, for feedback, and then coming back to Kyrgyzstan. How many of you thought that's how domestic laws were drafted? Okay, we have a couple of skeptical observers back there, but it's a little different, right, from how we think about domestic laws typically coming into being. And then the final stage is one that I think is really interesting, and this actually was very striking to me, is in most governments there's a working group that's set up to draft, debate, deliberate new legislation. And what we find is that in the working groups that are set up to draft or deliberate domestic investment laws, there are very often, particularly in low-income countries, external participants. So it could be FIAS, right, consultants or local lawyers, but in a country that recently drafted a law without any help from FIAS, it was USAID, right, so the US aid agency, as well as the American Chamber of Commerce, plus officials from the local Chamber of Commerce, right? So this is the drafting of domestic legislation, but all these people are in the room. So our conclusion from all of this is the drafting of domestic investment laws is rarely just a domestic process, right? It actually can involve and is often permeated by external actors. So I know that I have been speaking for quite a while, so I want to end with 3 provocative questions to get us started. The first question is, if we adopt a default assumption, like the one that I've been talking about today, the domestic investment laws were probably drafted with heavy external involvement, should tribunals adopt a liberal or an expansive interpretation when faced with an ambiguous consent provision? So put your hands up if you think that the information that I've given you today about how these laws, or some of these laws may have been drafted, should that affect how tribunals interpret these laws? Hands up if you think it should affect interpretation. Okay, so for the camera that's about, what, 2/3 of the room maybe? And how many people don't think it should affect it at all? Okay, so about 1/3 of the room doesn't think it should affect it at all. So this, David Caron was a very eminent arbitrator, and he noted that typically most of these cases, arbitral tribunals incline toward a liberal interpretation of these laws if the consent provision is unclear. And this contradicts the ILC Guiding Principle 7, which states that tribunals or adjudicators should adopt a restrictive interpretation in case of doubt about what the domestic drafters intended. But he says that's okay because legislation is discussed at length and is frequently the result of compromise between various constituents. Legal counsel is involved, procedures are followed, by which the problems of confusion are hopefully removed from the law. So he's making very strong assumptions that because of all the deliberation that goes into these laws, it's okay if we interpret them expansively. So we think, well, maybe you could question this. We can debate that more. Okay, our second conclusion is, should FIAS, bilateral donors, or other advisors continue to recommend arbitration access in domestic laws? So thinking purely from the point of view of an aid agency now, right? Purely from the point of view of, say, USAID or AusAid or one of these other agencies, they may be concerned about their own reputation. There are reasons for them to maybe update their guidance, right? So how many of you have heard about the controversies over investor-state arbitration? Yeah? It's fairly controversial, right? It's very politically salient. And what's happened is when governments, for instance, Myanmar, received a recommendation to include consent to arbitration into its domestic law, that then generated all sorts of contestation from within Myanmar, but also from groups outside of Myanmar, right? So it really endangered the entire reform process that was going on regarding that investment law in Myanmar. So it seems like by continuing to recommend arbitration access, these donors are really putting at risk larger reform projects that they may not want to sacrifice for this project. So this is also something that can be debated. The third conclusion is, should governments rewrite their investment laws to remove arbitration access? So if I were just to ask you that, how many of you in the room think, based on the presentation today, that governments, if you were in a government ministry, would you recommend rewriting this investment law? Yeah? Okay, that was about half. How many of you would not recommend the investment law if you could rewrite it at all? Okay. It's a very quiet first week of school. So several governments have done this. But what's interesting is governments tend to rewrite their laws to remove consent after they've faced large arbitration cases, right? So they struggle to kind of gain maybe the awareness or gain the sort of, to have this issue be important enough to generate a rewriting of the law. But then once they face cases, then they tend to remove consent. And there may also be risks or obstacles to removing this access, right? So one thing is, it's just tough to get an issue like this to the top of the policy agenda. And that's why we think it may be easier after you face a claim, right? Because then people are really angry, then they want to make a change and make sure that they don't lose a case like that ever again. The other thing is ministries may be wary of taking actions that are perceived to create a more restrictive environment for foreign investment. So things like the World Bank doing business indicators or other indices like that, they don't actually take into account if you provide access to arbitration in your domestic law, but it sort of is something that a lot of government officials think about, right? How will this reflect on the environment for foreign investment that we have in our country? If we take this action, will it be assessed negatively? Well, that's fair to investors. So these are all considerations that governments might have. Okay, I think I want to leave it there with those three questions so that I can hear from you and hear what you think about this. Thank you.
I will just ask about the last slide. You have a list of countries that have rewritten their laws to remove consent. Is it correct to assume that some of these countries take advantage of change of the regime, abrupt change of the regime to rewrite this law? Like I'm thinking about Egypt and Tunisia. I don't know the exact dates when they wrote the laws, but I had the impression that it was following the Arab Springs, because Egypt, for instance, faced a lot of claims just after the Arab Springs, and then they said, okay, this is a new regime and we are getting rid of these laws, and it may be easier for them to make this change accepted when it's a change of regime.
Yeah. Should I leave the microphone on?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
No. Yeah, it's a great question. So these examples of Egypt and Tunisia are actually from much earlier. They're actually, I think, from 76? No, maybe in the 1980s. But it's pre-Arab Spring. And so what happened is Egypt faced a large claim, and then Tunisia, after the large claim, Egypt removed it, and Tunisia did as well. But I think that you're correct, that after the Arab Spring, particularly since Egypt faced a lot of claims, that it created opportunities for them to revisit some of these laws and treaties. I don't know, have they actually changed any of their treaty obligations? You can investigate and get back to us. Yes?
Have you received any feedback from FIAS to your conclusions?
So no, this paper is brand new. So it's just becoming public. Are there conclusions that you anticipate, or?
I mean, they would think about their actions more carefully now and like reforming the work that they do. I mean, once that they see these findings.
Yes. So I think that's in some ways a best case scenario outcome for me, not for Charles, is that since investor-state arbitration has become so controversial, that controversy creates an opportunity for organizations like FIAS to revisit the guidance that they've been giving to countries. So maybe they don't use this paper as an impetus for their reform, but maybe they look at broader reform processes and discussions that are going on within the UN and within some of their governments. Because one thing that FIAS advisors, but others have also noted, is that when they recommend arbitration access, it's becoming more controversial. So governments are much more reluctant to include arbitration than they were previously. So we think that there are probably a confluence of things happening that might make it easy for FIAS to update its guidance. So hopefully, we haven't seen yet.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you for the presentation. My question is, one of my questions is, to which extent the consent you find in domestic laws would be so different from the one you find in BITs?
Yeah, do you mean the actual language of the provisions?
Yeah, because I have the feeling that you're assuming that the consent you find in this kind of laws is more liberal in a sense than the one there are in BITs. So, but is it true? I mean, what do you mean by why there is such a distinction to make between the consent filed in these domestic laws by comparison with what you find in BITs, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for those of you that haven't had investment law, a lot of bilateral investment treaties are drafted off model text. So if we think about the spread of bilateral investment treaties, we can sort of think about it as a hub and spoke pattern, where Germany had a model treaty, the US had a model treaty, a couple others had model treaties, and then Germany went out and negotiated off that model with 112 or something other countries. And so a lot of the consent provisions in BITs look very, very similar to one another. And a lot of them are usually very clear, and they may be very clear in what they give consent to, as well as where there are exceptions, be it policy exceptions or otherwise. Since there have been fewer cases that are based on domestic laws, and since often these domestic laws are written in the local language, there may be an English translation, but it may be unofficial. So there's kind of fewer cases to go off of, and the laws are not necessarily in English. They haven't been negotiated as carefully often. They're just sort of untested. So they're unfamiliar.
So because you said that they accept to go through a very costly process by consenting to arbitration, but in a sense it's true that then they have to, it's an EU process because they have to overcome the distinctions of the parties in their country, but in a sense they don't have to go through the bilateral process of negotiating a BIT, so they could fashion, if they do it properly, could be a good way to consent to arbitration in the sense that it could have been done differently. Don't you think? I mean,
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So in theory, right, if this were an area where I think governments were really focusing a lot of their energy, and they knew that they wanted to consent to arbitration, but they wanted to do it in a very specific way. So maybe after a case had been in domestic courts for 4 years, and if it was a case in this industry and there was something else, right, if they wanted to include a lot of conditions on that consent, domestic law would be a great way to do it. Yeah. And then not have any bilateral investment treaty or something like that, right? You could really kind of modulate exactly what you want since you don't have to negotiate it. It would be fantastic if that's the way the world would work. I can't think of an example of a domestic law that to me looks like that's what happened. But you're right. Going forward, maybe we'll see things like that.
Okay.
I think up to now we have.
So I have a question that goes both to the the helping drafting laws process, and as well as possibly needing to change them. Did you have the chance to see whether, after passing these laws with consent to arbitration, there was a substantial improving in their foreign investment performance? So the country did actually have a benefit that would balance with the risks or the all the critiques that you have to the system?
Yeah, good. So this is, I feel like this should be everyone's first question, right? So what impact are these laws actually having? And I think one of the difficult things of doing this empirically is these laws often contain a whole group of reforms. So arbitration would just be one small part of this new law that comes into force, and that's the part that we're really interested in. So it's a difficult thing to test, but saying that, there have not, to my knowledge, been any studies that found a positive effect when countries, arbitration.
I believe some studies were done with BATs, right? So like, I think UNTA tried to like compare like BAT performance and like what kind of investment did it attract and stuff. So it might be hard with domestic laws, but what is your thought about like what happened with BATs? Like, does it really give the states a benefit enough to carry the burden, or is it something on a case-by-case basis?
Yeah, so I think if you want a reference for this, my favorite is Bonilla, Paulson, and Weibel have a new book where they go through all of the studies, all of the quantitative studies of does signing a bilateral investment treaty or ratifying one lead to more investment? And they come to this conclusion that the studies are inconclusive, but probably not. And I think for me, what's really interesting is if we think about the World Bank, right, as one of the world's most esteemed producers of statistics about foreign investment, right, with expertise that far outstrips almost any university economics department, they have yet to produce a study that would show a positive impact for adding consent arbitration. So for me, it's a case where the absence is very telling.
It speaks in itself.
Yes. Yeah.
Just that you can also add, there are also studies, not anecdotal studies, but studies that ask general counsel of companies and about whether treaties or arbitration are a determinative component of their investment decisions. And in those studies, they find that they're not, or they're very low consideration for companies in their decisions.
Yeah, and one other thing on that, where South Africa, which Brooke had mentioned, South Africa exited all of its bilateral investment treaties, and so economists and others were really watching to see what happened to foreign investment flows in South Africa, and nothing happened. They didn't go down at all.
Okay. I have had some experience on foreign direct investments for a large corporation, and I can tell you that at least the decision on whether or not to take advantage of a bilateral investment treaty is an afterthought after the decision to go into a country has happened. So we would decide to, let's say, put $500 million into a plant in Brazil. Then we will see, the lawyers will come in and say, how do we structure this so that we have this protection, right? So it's really an afterthought. But I have two questions for you. The first one is, which I think is very important, is how do these domestic laws define investment? Which, as you know, it's key when you look at bilateral investment treaties. You have a wide range of definitions for investment, and exit actually is not very clear on it as well, right? So,
yes.
So that's my first question. The second question is, should there be a change in domestic law on a retroactive basis? Would that erase your right to arbitration? And what I'm thinking here is, when you look at the restructuring in Greece, the Greek government went in and added collective action clauses to the domestic law bonds, and they upheld in court, right? So they forced everybody into a large haircut restructuring by doing so. And I wonder if, this could be the case as well.
Yeah, so it's an excellent question, particularly when it comes time to think more about policy reforms. By changing the law, do you then trigger potential new treaty-based claims or other things? And my sense is this could be done in a way that wouldn't necessarily trigger new claims. Maybe there would be lessons to learn from the Greek example of adding those collective action clauses. So I think it can be done, but I think it's a very important thing to take into consideration in the process that's followed and how this is done. On your first question, did you want me to
Investment.
Definition of investment.
Definition of investment.
Oh, yes. So we should have included that in our study, but there's actually, we didn't. If you go to the UNTAD website, they have recently mapped all of these maybe not all of these, but most of the laws that we've covered. And there what you're able to do is compare how these different laws define investment. I think in many cases you'll find that these laws are more specific, certainly in the exit convention, which for those of you that are new to investment law, does not include a definition of investment because it was the view of the chief framers of the convention that any attempt to define investment would restrict it, and they didn't want to restrict what could be an investment. So it's been for 60 years now, it's been this very controversial absence of a definition. So more specific than exit most of these laws, but I think there's quite a bit of variance in my sense.
Thank you.
Check out there.
So acknowledging you caveated this whole thing that there was no coercion, I'm wondering if you did any analysis of sort of the dependency of the economy on like IFC or MIGA supported investments, or not?
Yeah.
If you didn't look at
Good.
that.
So it's a very perceptive question. So the IFC is the International Finance Corporation, and MIGA is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Organization. Those are both private sector arms of the World Bank. And so what we do find is the countries that receive advice from FIAS tend to be countries that have large World Bank programs to begin with. So perhaps that is loans from the IBRD or even IDA, which are the two World Bank public sector arms. Perhaps they are projects from the private sector arms of the World Bank. So it's, in some ways, it's not a coincidence the countries into which FIAS advisors go. And I think they're also, maybe stopping short of asserting there's coercion, I think we have noticed some interesting patterns where if a World Bank loan application is pending, or there may be other considerations for the government, we can all imagine situations where a government official would say, okay, so for the next 6 months, we want to do everything we can to get on the World Bank's good side. This might be a policy action that would help.
Does this feature in the OECD's investment policy reviews if they have to take it, they don't even look at what they get?
No. You didn't mention it, but it's not an important part of their reviews.
Yeah, and the arbitration, it relates to your first question about the impact of this lawmaking process on the interpretation of the law by the arbitrators. And what in your way would have the arbitrators in this case? Because in a sense, to argue a strict interpretation of this law would be an argument of the state, right? I mean, it's really defensive. But on the other hand, from what I understood that I'm speaking is that the FIAS review is not mandatory, right?
Yeah.
And on the other hand, the law has been enacted by a sovereign. So what could an arbitrator do in this instance now?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the first instance, it would be up to counsel, right, to bring all of this drafting history forward. And to my knowledge, others may know better, but I don't think counsel, I can't think of an instance that I know of where counsel has brought this up. That actually there were all these external advisors who were helping with the law. So I think it would be counsel's job, but I think arbitrators have quite a bit of discretion when it comes to ambiguous provisions, depending on what counsel has put in front of it. So I'm not sure exactly what they would come up with, but I think there might be enough scope for them to say. And maybe not make huge leaps, but where they could choose between a restrictive and expansive interpretation. In case of doubt, follow ILC guidance instead of step to market. Something like that. I think that's within their scope. But it could be, that's just me.
We're mindful of the time.
Yeah.
So thank you again.